The fire at 221B Baker Street had been burning since mid-afternoon. It had started, as good fires do, with a single decisive act. Holmes had folded his newspaper, set it aside with the particular finality of a man who has extracted every useful thought from its columns, and without a word had arranged 3 additional lumps of coal in the grate, with the precise geometry he reserved for problems he had not yet named. Watson had watched. This, from behind his own paper, said nothing, and quietly turned a page. This was the particular language of Baker Street evenings, and Watson had become, over the years, entirely fluent in it. That had been some hours ago. Now the fire had mellowed into something deeply comfortable, a low, steady glow that pushed the shadows back to the room's edges and painted everything amber. The coal had settled into itself, breathing softly, the occasional small collapse sending up a brief shimmer that crossed the ceiling and disappeared. Outside, London was doing what London does best on an October evening, which is to say it was raining, with a quiet, thorough commitment, as if it had planned to rain all along, and was simply now getting around to it. The drops came against the window panes in irregular rhythms, not a storm, not a drizzle, but something in between, the kind of rain that makes indoors feel like a deliberate choice, rather than mere shelter. Watson had relocated to the armchair closest to the hearth some time earlier, a decision he did not regret. His medical journals lay on the side table, consulted, and then abandoned in favor of a novel that demanded rather less of him. He was at a comfortable point, not quite reading, not quite drifting, that pleasant threshold between attention and rest, where the words on the page become less important than the warmth at one's feet and the sound of weather being kept politely outside. Holmes was at the window. Not in any dramatic fashion. He was simply standing there with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the wet street below with an expression of mild, unfocused interest, the way a man looks at something when he is not really looking at it at all. He was in his dressing gown, the deep burgundy one that Mrs. Hudson had twice suggested needed replacing, and which Holmes had twice failed entirely to hear her say. His violin lay on the settee behind him, bow set beside it, at an angle that suggested it had been recently played and recently set down, mid-thought. The room smelled of coal smoke and the last of the afternoon's tea, and something faintly resinous from the violin's strings, a warm, inhabited smell that Watson had long since stopped noticing except on evenings like this one, when the rain made everything inside feel particularly concentrated and particular. Mrs. Hudson had brought up the tea tray at 4:30. It had been a generous tray, pot and cosy, 2 cups, a small plate of plain biscuits, a dish of butter that had gone slightly soft beside the fire, and a rack of toast that had arrived perfectly and was now rather less so, having sat for the better part of an hour. Watson had eaten 2 pieces anyway. Holmes had eaten nothing, which was entirely characteristic, though Watson had long ago stopped cataloguing this as a concern, and now registered it simply as data. Holmes, in this particular state of quiet, standing at windows, eating nothing, was a Holmes in the early stages of something. Not a problem, not yet a case. A question that hadn't fully introduced itself. Watson turned another page and listened to the rain. It was, he thought, one of the more underappreciated qualities of their shared life at Baker Street, these evenings, where nothing happened. He had written enough of their adventures to know that the extraordinary ones made for better reading, and he was not ungrateful for them. But there was a particular quality to these quieter hours, a depth of comfort that came specifically from the contrast, from knowing that the city outside held its usual quotient of fog and mystery and difficulty, and that in here, for now, there was only the fire and the butter-soft armchair and the companionable silence of a man he trusted completely, standing at the window for reasons Watson did not require explained. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the half-hour, 7:30 then. Holmes turned from the window. "Watson," he said in the tone he used when he was about to say something that had no apparent connection to anything. Said Watson. "The rain began at 4 minutes past 3 this afternoon." Watson considered this. "Did it?" "It will not stop before midnight." Holmes crossed to the settee, regarded his violin for a moment, and then did not pick it up. "The clouds are the particular grey-yellow that comes off the Thames when the tide is going out and the temperature drops. It is a colour one learns." "I shall take your word for it," Watson said. Holmes sat. He picked up a page from the scatter of papers on the low table, one of several, Watson noted, that seemed to have migrated there from Holmes's desk over the course of the afternoon without any apparent human assistance, and regarded it without expression. Watson returned to his novel. The fire settled again, sending a brief warmth across the carpet. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson was moving, the soft, purposeful sounds of her evening routine distinct as birdsong to anyone who had lived long enough above it to learn the pattern. The kettle going on. A cupboard closing with its familiar click. Footsteps to the parlour and back. The quiet industry of a woman who kept a household running with the patient efficiency of a very well-managed small country. Watson had just reached a moderately interesting passage about a country house in Devonshire when they heard the bell. Not the upstairs bell, the street door. And not the bright, confident ring of a visitor with purpose and appointment, but the softer, slightly uncertain ring of someone who has stood for a moment in the rain deciding whether to ring at all, and who has rung not from confidence, but from some interior calculation that has tipped, barely, in favour of trying. Holmes's head came up, not sharply. It was a gradual lift, like a man surfacing from a thought, rather than startled out of one. But his eyes changed. Watson knew that change. It was the small, precise shift from absence to presence, from looking at nothing to looking at everything. And it happened with the particular speed that always struck Watson as slightly inhuman, though he meant that in the best possible way. They heard Mrs. Hudson's footsteps to the front door. A brief exchange, voices too low to distinguish, though the cadence was clear. Her measured, a little questioning, the visitors short and halting. Then the door closing. Then her footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway with an expression Watson had come to read as mildly intrigued, but professionally composed. "A boy, gentlemen," she said. "A messenger, or something of the kind. Very wet. He had a paper for Mr. Holmes, but when I asked his name and his errand he became quite vague, and before I could press him further he thanked me and went back into the street." She paused. "He left this." She placed a folded paper on the side table nearest the door. Not Holmes's desk. Not Watson's. Table. Simply the nearest flat surface, as if she was not quite sure what category of thing it belonged to. "He did not wait for a reply?" Holmes asked. "He did not wait at all," said Mrs. Hudson. "He was down the step and into the rain before I had properly opened the door to its full extent." She looked at the paper with the mild disaffection she reserved for objects that had caused her unnecessary bother. "It's rather damp." "Everything is rather damp this evening," Holmes said pleasantly. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson." She withdrew, pulling the door not quite closed behind her, which was her way of indicating she was still in the vicinity and available, should the damp paper prove to require additional domestic management. Holmes did not move toward the paper immediately. This was, Watson had learned, not indifference, but its opposite. A form of consideration, the deliberate pause before examination, the practiced patience of a man who believes that first impressions are most valuable when one approaches them without urgency. He sat for a moment with his hands steepled in front of his face in that way he had. The tips of his fingers pressed lightly together, looking at the paper from across the room with the attentive stillness of a naturalist who has spotted something interesting in the undergrowth and is taking a moment before approaching, lest it take fright. Watson said nothing. He turned a page he hadn't read. Then Holmes rose, crossed the room in a few unhurried strides, and picked up the paper. It was, Watson could see from where he sat, a single sheet, or rather, a portion of a sheet. It had been torn rather than cut, the right-hand edge ragged and uneven. It had been folded in thirds, standard enough for a letter. But when Holmes opened it and held it toward the lamp, it was immediately apparent that it was not a letter. There was no salutation, no address, no signature. There were columns, numbers, dates perhaps, though the light was not quite sufficient to read them from a distance. An account page, then, or a portion of one. Holmes held it for a long moment. He tilted it toward the fire's light, then toward the lamp, then held it at an angle that suggested he was looking not at the numbers, but at the paper itself, at its surface, its texture, its particular quality of damaged wetness. He said. Watson looked up from his novel with the resigned affection of a man who knows what that particular syllable means. "Interesting?" he asked. Holmes set the paper on his desk with a deliberateness that told Watson it would be exactly where he had placed it for some time to come. "Possibly," he said, which in Holmes's vocabulary meant almost certainly. He returned to the settee. He picked up his violin after all. He drew the bow across the lowest string once, softly, listened to the note decay into the room's warm air, and then began to play something slow and without obvious structure. Not a piece, exactly, but the outline of one, the way a man might hum while thinking. Watson looked at the paper on the desk. From his armchair he could not make out its contents, only its damaged edge, the torn margin, and the faint impression of columns of figures that the lamplight caught in brief relief. It had the look of something that had been handled, then carried some distance, then handled again in the rain, paper that had been through something, modest though that something might be. He thought about asking. He decided not to, not yet. This was, he had found, usually the better approach, to let Holmes begin his questions before Watson started his own, since Holmes's questions had a way of answering Watson's before they were asked, and the reverse was rarely true. Outside, the rain continued with its quiet, thorough commitment. The clock marked 8 o'clock. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps moved through the house below with their familiar evening rhythm. Holmes played his slow, unfinished melody, and the fire breathed in the grate, and the city outside kept its usual secrets with its usual patience. And on Holmes's desk the torn ledger page lay in the lamplight, its ink smeared in ways that meant something to someone, its figures adding up, or not quite adding up, in the particular way that small and ordinary pieces of paper sometimes do when they have further to travel than the person who sent them intended. Watson turned a page. The evening settled around them like a coat, and somewhere out in the wet streets of London a messenger was already gone, already swallowed by fog and rain, carrying with him an errand Watson did not yet understand, and leaving behind on Holmes's desk the first quiet thread of something that would, in its own unhurried way, take the rest of the week to unravel. Watson slept well that night. This was, in itself, unremarkable. Watson was, by disposition and medical training both, a man who understood the value of sleep and pursued it without guilt. Holmes, by contrast, had spent some portion of the night in the manner Watson had grown entirely accustomed to, moving quietly about the sitting-room, occasionally holding things up to the lamp, occasionally setting things down again, and at one point, Watson was fairly certain, though not fully awake, playing 4 or 5 notes on the violin very softly, as if testing a thought rather than a melody. By morning, Holmes was asleep in his chair. Watson came downstairs at 7:30 to find him there, still in the burgundy dressing-gown, feet tucked beneath him in that improbable arrangement he favoured, chin dropped slightly toward his chest, the particular stillness of a man who has thought until thinking gave way to unconsciousness rather than intention. The fire had burned down to a pale grey architecture of ash. The lamp on the desk had been turned low, but not extinguished. And the ledger page, the torn, damp, rain-carried page from the previous evening, had been moved not far. It had been shifted from its original position on the desk to a spot nearer the lamp, and it had company now. Beside it lay 2 other papers, a leaf torn from one of Holmes's commonplace books, covered in his small, precise handwriting, and a newspaper cutting, very recent, folded to a specific column. Watson looked at this arrangement for a moment with the mild curiosity of a man reading signs he cannot yet interpret, and then went to see about breakfast. Mrs. Hudson had anticipated him, as she generally did. The table in the small dining area had been laid with quiet efficiency. Pot of tea already breathing under its wool cosy, 2 boiled eggs in their cups, a rack of toast with the butter soft and ready, a pot of marmalade that caught the grey morning light and held it amber. Rain was still falling outside, lighter now than the previous evening but persistent, the kind that settles in for the week and means it. The windows had fogged gently at their lower panes. London beyond them was a watercolour of itself, all smudged grey and soft-edged brown, the street below empty except for a coalman's cart, moving with patient slowness toward the square. Watson poured his tea, sat down, and was halfway through his first egg before Holmes appeared in the doorway. He looked, Watson thought, exactly as a man looks who has slept in a chair for an indeterminate number of hours, and considers this an entirely satisfactory outcome. His hair was mildly disordered. His eyes, however, were entirely alert. That particular quality of Holmes's wakefulness that seemed to begin at full capacity, regardless of what had preceded it, as though sleep was simply a mechanical pause in a process that required no warming up. "Morning," said Watson. "Toast," said Holmes, which was both greeting and request, and sat down opposite him. Watson passed the rack. Holmes took a piece, regarded it briefly as if it might contain information, and then ate it with the focused efficiency of a man fueling himself for something specific. "You were up late," Watson observed. "I was up early," Holmes corrected pleasantly. "The distinction matters. It was after 2 when I heard you at the lamp. Then I was up late and early, both, which is simply called being awake, and is not worthy of medical concern." He reached for the teapot. "The paper is interesting, Watson." Watson looked up. "The ledger page?" Holmes poured his tea and held the cup with both hands, looking at the window rather than at Watson, in the way he sometimes looked at things when he was seeing something else entirely. "Not the numbers. The numbers are almost beside the point at the moment. It is the paper itself that merits attention." "In what way?" Holmes set down his cup. He had the expression he wore when deciding how much to explain. Not secretiveness, Watson had long understood, but precision. Holmes disliked explaining a thing before he was certain of it, because an uncertain explanation introduced the possibility of revision, and revision required he spend time correcting an impression he had created himself, which he found inefficient. "Later," he said, "after I have seen something more." Watson accepted this without argument, as he had learned to do, and finished his egg. The marmalade was very good, bitter orange with a good set, the kind Mrs. Hudson bought from a particular shop in Crawford Street that Holmes had once, during a case involving a Covent Garden greengrocer, correctly identified as the source of a specific variety of Seville peel, to the considerable bewilderment of the investigating constable present. Watson had thought about that moment occasionally since. Life at Baker Street had a way of making the domestic feel quietly remarkable. After breakfast, Holmes retreated to the sitting-room, and Watson followed with the morning paper. It was an ordinary enough paper, shipping news, parliamentary business, a letter to the editor about the state of Marylebone's guttering, 2 small items about property transactions in the city. Watson read it with moderate interest. Holmes had his own copy, which he had already received before Watson came downstairs, and which he had apparently read with his usual comprehensive speed, since it was already folded in thirds and set aside with the particular finality Watson recognized from the previous evening. It was around 9:30 that Watson made his mistake. He had been, he would maintain afterward, entirely well-intentioned. Holmes's desk had been in a state of moderate disorder. Not unusual, not alarming, but the kind of productive accumulation that Watson's medical orderliness occasionally found difficult to look at without mild distress. The ledger page, the notebook leaf, the newspaper cutting, and now a second cutting that had appeared from somewhere. All of it spread across the desk surface in an arrangement that looked, to Watson's eye, entirely random. He thought he would be helpful. He was straightening the papers, simply squaring their edges, aligning the cuts with the cuts, the page with the page, when Holmes's voice came from the armchair with a calm, complete authority. "Watson, please don't." Watson paused, both hands on the papers. "I know precisely what you were only doing," Holmes said, without heat, "and I am grateful for the impulse. However—" He rose from the chair and crossed the room, and Watson stepped back as Holmes regarded the desk with the focused attention of a man surveying territory. "The position of each paper relative to the others is presently part of the record. If you align them, you will have tidied away approximately a third of what I know so far." Watson looked at the papers. They appeared, to him, entirely unchanged from disorderly. "They are just papers," he said, knowing even as he said it that this was the wrong sentence. "They are never just papers," Holmes said, gently, and with the patient kindness of a teacher who has said a thing so many times it has become affectionate rather than corrective. He studied the arrangement for a moment, then, apparently satisfied that Watson's partial intervention had not disturbed anything critical, moved the lamp slightly and sat on the edge of the desk chair. "Come and look," he said, "since you are here." Watson came and looked. The ledger page lay at the centre. In morning light it looked, if anything, more prosaic than it had the previous evening. A rectangle of cream paper, moderately good quality, with columns of figures in brown ink. The right edge was torn. The top had been cut, a straight cut, not a tear, suggesting it had been removed from a bound ledger rather than a loose stack. 3 columns of numbers ran down the page, each with a date alongside it. The dates, Watson could see now, ran across roughly 6 weeks. "What are these columns?" he asked. "Receipts," Holmes said, "and disbursements, and a running total." He pointed without touching. "This is a page from an accounts ledger, not a private household's. Note the paper stock, which is a commercial grade, relatively inexpensive, but consistent. The sort a small office or counting house buys in quantity. A private household tends toward better quality or worse, depending on means. Offices tend toward the uniform middle." "How can you tell the paper stock from a glance?" "Weight, texture, and the particular way the ink sits on the surface. It has sunk slightly, which is characteristic of papers with a lower sizing content. Better paper resists ink more. It lies on the surface. This ink has been absorbed. You can see it in the edges of the numbers. They feather slightly." He leaned closer. "Now, look at the smearing." Watson looked. He had registered the smearing the previous evening as simply the result of rain. The page had been carried by a wet messenger through a wet night, and paper and rain are old adversaries. But Holmes was directing his attention now to something more specific. "The smearing runs in one direction only," Holmes said. "Here and here. The lower columns are smeared rightward. The upper columns are almost clean." "He carried it in his coat," Watson suggested. "Inside pocket. The lower portion would be more exposed to rain coming up from below." Holmes glanced at him with the quick, approving look that Watson had always found disproportionately satisfying. "Very good. Yes, which tells us the messenger carried it tucked against himself, lower edge out, which is how a person carries something they are trying to protect, rather than merely transport. He was taking some care with it." He paused, and yet he left it with barely a word and disappeared into the rain. Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he was instructed, Holmes said. Those are different kinds of caution. He straightened up. "But there is something else. Look at the stamp." Watson looked. "In" was blurred. The ink spread beyond the was blurred. The ink spread beyond the stamp's boundaries unevenly. "Rain again," Watson offered. "Rain, certainly, but look at the direction of the blur. It runs upward and to the left, while the smearing on the numbers runs rightward and down. If the same rain event had caused both, they would run in the same direction. They do not." Watson looked more carefully. Holmes was right. The stamp's blur was almost perpendicular to the ink runs in the columns below. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means the stamp was blurred before the page was carried out into the rain," Holmes said. "Something damp touched it, a finger, a cloth, a wet surface the page was laid upon indoors. And then, subsequently, the page was carried out, and the columns acquired their own water damage. The stamp was damaged first, separately." Watson straightened up and looked at Holmes. "Someone deliberately obscured the stamp. Or carelessly. It may not have been deliberate, a wet desk, a damp cloth nearby. But the effect is the same." Holmes moved toward the fire, where the morning coals had taken well and were burning with a clean, steady heat. "The stamp would have identified the office. Without it, we have figures, dates, and paper stock, but no name." "Can you read any of it?" Watson asked, looking at the blurred mark. "Fragments." Holmes took up his pipe from the mantelpiece, turned it in his hands without filling it. 2 letters, possibly 3, towards the right edge of the stamp where the blur thins. What appears to be a capital R and something after it, possibly an ampersand, possibly a capital A. He set the pipe down. "It is not yet enough." Watson looked out the window at the still falling rain. Below, the street had acquired a thin shine, the wet cobbles reflecting the grey sky back up at itself. A woman with a red umbrella passed quickly, and a delivery boy on a bicycle swerved around a puddle with more confidence than technique. "So we wait," Watson said. "We wait," Holmes agreed, and there was in his voice the comfortable equanimity of a man who has never found waiting difficult when there was something specific to wait for. He settled back into his armchair. He reached for his violin. He plucked one string, then another, listening to the intervals with his eyes half closed. Watson returned to his own chair, his newspaper, and the peaceful, ordinary warmth of a Baker Street morning. The torn ledger page lay on the desk in the lamplight, its damaged stamp keeping its small secret, its figures waiting patiently to be understood. Outside, London went about its business in the rain, counting houses and clerks and the endless, invisible arithmetic of a city that ran in large part on trust and paper, and occasionally on neither. The fire burned steadily. The rain continued. And Holmes played his slow intervals, and listened, and thought about things Watson couldn't yet follow, though the shape of them, faint and growing, was beginning to make itself felt in the room, the way a tune becomes recognizable, not all at once, but note by careful note. The afternoon arrived quietly, the way afternoons do in October, when the morning has already spent most of the weather's ambition, and left behind only a steady, mild grey. The rain had thinned to something barely worth naming, a fine, persistent mist that clung to coat sleeves and lamp-posts and the fur trim of passing collars without ever quite committing to the full effort of proper rain. London moved through it with the practised indifference of a city that has long since made its peace with damp. At 221B, the sitting room had reached that particular mid-afternoon equilibrium that Watson found deeply agreeable. Fire rebuilt to a comfortable middle height. The breakfast things long since cleared by Mrs. Hudson, fresh coals laid, the room smelling of coal smoke, and the faint cedar of Holmes's pipe tobacco, and the wool of the hearthrug drying very slightly from the morning's chill. Holmes had been reading, or appearing to read, which was sometimes the same thing, and sometimes emphatically not. A volume from the shelf that Watson recognized as a directory of city commercial enterprises. He had not commented on this. He had made fresh tea, settled in his armchair with his medical journal, and allowed the afternoon to arrange itself. It was at 20 minutes past 2 that the bell rang the first time. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps, the door. A brief exchange in the hall below, then the familiar measured ascent of her tread on the stairs. "A Miss Clemence Holt, gentlemen," she said, appearing in the doorway with her customary composed expression. "She says she has no appointment, but wonders if Mr. Holmes might spare a moment. She seems quite—" Mrs. Hudson paused in the way she paused, when selecting her word carefully. Thoughtful. Holmes set down his directory. "Please show her up, Mrs. Hudson." The woman who entered was perhaps 40, neatly dressed in a dark wool coat that had been recently brushed, a small hat pinned at a careful angle. She carried a cloth bag, the practical, capacious kind, and she moved with the quiet purposefulness of someone accustomed to managing their own errands and their own time. She was not distressed. She was, Watson thought, precisely the kind of person Mrs. Hudson had meant by thoughtful, a person who had considered whether to come, decided yes, and arrived composed in the decision. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I am sorry to arrive without notice. I am a seamstress. I work from home in Clerkenwell, and I have no remarkable reason to trouble you, except—" She paused, opened the cloth bag, and produced a small book, paper-covered, the kind used for dressmaking patterns. "I came to return this, which I borrowed some weeks ago from a neighbour, and when I took it from my shelf this morning, I found this inside." She held out the pattern book and, tucked between its pages, a small slip of paper. A receipt of some kind, Watson could see, pale and slightly creased. Holmes rose and took both from her with a courtesy that managed to be entirely natural. He glanced at the pattern book, a single comprehensive glance of the kind that Watson knew was not a glance at all, and then at the receipt. "Sit down, Miss Holt," he said pleasantly. "Watson, would you pour?" "Already doing so," said Watson, who was. She sat in the chair nearest the fire, and folded her hands in her lap, with the patient composure of a woman who is not sure what she has brought, but suspects it might matter. "Tell me about the receipt," Holmes said, settling opposite her, the slip of paper held lightly between his fingers. "I didn't look at it carefully when I first found it," she said. "I thought it was simply a piece of paper used as a bookmark. My neighbour is practical in that way. But then I saw the figures, and they seemed—" She paused again, choosing carefully. "Not quite right, for what they were meant to represent." "In what way not quite right?" "The total is wrong," she said simply and without drama. "I keep my own household accounts, Mr. Holmes. I always have. And the figures on that receipt add to something different from what is written at the bottom as the total. Not by much. A few pence. But wrong." She looked at him steadily. "My neighbour pays her household accounts through a counting house in the city. Many women in our street do. It is arranged through the landlord's agent. I thought perhaps it was an error. But I thought perhaps someone ought to see it." Holmes looked at the receipt for a long moment. He turned it over. He held it toward the window's grey light. "You did quite right to come," he said. There was in his voice the particular quality of settled calm that Watson recognized as Holmes being very interested, and working carefully not to communicate exactly how much. "May I keep this for the time being?" "Please," she said. She stayed perhaps 10 minutes more, long enough for her tea, which she drank with evident appreciation, and for Holmes to ask a few questions so gently framed they were barely recognizable as questions. About the counting-house, about the arrangement through the landlord's agent, about whether her neighbour had mentioned any discrepancies herself. Miss Holt answered everything thoughtfully, apologized again for arriving without appointment, thanked Mrs. Hudson on her way out for the tea, and left with the quiet dignity with which she had arrived. Holmes stood at the desk and laid the receipt beside the ledger page. Watson came to look. Even to his eye, the paper stock was similar, not identical, but of the same family. Commercial grade, uniform middle quality, the kind bought in quantity. "Same office?" he asked. "Same supplier, certainly," Holmes said. "Possibly the same office." He looked at the receipt's figures for a moment. "The total is wrong," as she said. "4d low on the true sum. An insignificant error, if it is an error." "Is it?" Holmes said nothing. He went back to his chair. He picked up the city directory again and turned pages with quiet deliberation. Watson returned to his armchair, to his journal, to the fire's steady warmth. The rain beyond the windows continued its mild persistence. Coal smoke and cedar, and the faint ghost of Miss Holt's practical wool coat. At 4 o'clock, the bell rang again. This visitor was a different kind entirely. An older man, 70 perhaps, with the upright bearing of a former schoolmaster, and the careful, slightly formal manner that Watson associated with people who have spent long years in front of rooms full of young people, and have internalized the permanent dignity this requires. He gave his name as Mr. Aubrey Fenn. He said he had come on a matter that was probably nothing, and he sat in the offered chair with a small leather-bound notebook on his knee that he touched occasionally, as if reassuring himself it was still there. His matter, it emerged over the quiet course of a cup of tea and Holmes's patient, unhurried attention, was this. He was recently retired, living modestly in rooms near Euston, managing his own small income with meticulous care. For the past 3 months he had been paying certain household accounts: coal, a small regular grocery order, a subscription to a reading room, through an arrangement recommended by his landlord. A counting house in the city handled the disbursements. He had kept his own parallel record, as was his habit, and last week he had compared his record to the receipts returned to him by the counting house. "They do not match," he said, with the composed precision of a man who checks his own arithmetic twice before speaking. "Across 3 months, the discrepancy amounts to—" He opened the notebook, found the page with the ease of long familiarity. 1 shilling and 4d, various small amounts, never more than 6d in a single transaction. He looked at Holmes. "I have accounted for every other possibility, Mr. Holmes. I was a mathematics teacher for 31 years. I do not make errors of this kind." Holmes listened to all of this with his eyes half closed and his fingers pressed lightly together, the posture Watson privately called his cathedral, because it suggested something being constructed upward, brick by careful brick. "Your landlord," Holmes said, "the name of the counting house he recommended?" Mr. Fenn gave it. Holmes's expression did not change. "Thank you," he said pleasantly. "You have been very precise, which is exactly what is required. May I borrow your notebook briefly? not to keep. I will return it within the day, simply to compare your figures with certain other records I have before me." Mr. Fenn agreed, clearly relieved at being taken seriously rather than redirected toward his bank. He left a quarter of an hour later, somewhat lighter in bearing, told that his arithmetic was entirely correct, and his concern well-founded, and that he would hear from Holmes within 2 days. When the door closed the second time, Watson watched Holmes cross to the desk and lay the borrowed notebook open beside the ledger page and Miss Holt's receipt. He stood looking at the 3 documents. Watson came to stand beside him and looked also. The ledger page with its smeared stamp and its columns of figures. The receipt with its 4-pence discrepancy. The retired schoolmaster's meticulous parallel record with its accumulated shilling and 4-pence across 3 months. "Same counting house," Watson said. "The same," Holmes confirmed. "And the same clerk, do you think?" Holmes traced one finger in the air above the figures without touching them, following something Watson could not quite see, a pattern in the numbers, a recurring shape. "The rounding is consistent," he said quietly. "Never more than 6-pence. Always downward. The figures returned to clients are always slightly less than the true receipts. Across any single account, the loss is trivial, barely worth noticing." He paused. "But Miss Holt's neighbour pays through this counting house. Mr. Fenn pays through this counting house. The ledger page was sent here by a messenger from, we may presume, someone connected to this counting house." He looked at Watson. "How many households does a small city counting house serve?" Watson thought about it. "Dozens, perhaps, if they manage disbursements for several landlords." "Dozens," Holmes agreed, "at a few pence each, across several months." He straightened up. "It becomes, over time, a quite different kind of sum." Watson looked at the 3 papers lying together in the lamplight. 3 small, ordinary, domestic documents, the kind that pass through London. Households every week without a second glance. A ledger page, a receipt, a notebook entry. "Someone is skimming the accounts," he said. "Carefully, consistently, and for some time," Holmes said. "Yes." He reached for his pipe, filled it this time, and stood at the mantelpiece looking at the fire with the settled expression of a man who has found the shape of a thing and is now simply measuring its dimensions. Outside, the mist had thickened back toward evening rain. The lamps were beginning to come on along Baker Street, soft orange smears in the gathering damp. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps moved below with their even, reassuring rhythm. Watson looked at the papers. 3 small threads, each barely worth pulling. Together, they were beginning to look like something that had been woven with considerable care. Evening had settled over Baker Street, with the unhurried confidence of something that knew it was expected. The lamps along the street had been lit by the time Watson drew the curtains, not fully, only 3/4 of the way, leaving a narrow band of window visible at the top, through which the wet orange glow of the nearest lamp-post filtered into the room and added itself to the fire's amber. It was the kind of light that made a room feel like an illustration of itself. Everything slightly more defined than in daylight, shadows warmer, surfaces richer. The coals in the grate had been freshened and were burning with a clean, even heat. Watson had retrieved his novel from where he'd left it that morning, and had read perhaps 4 pages since, which was about the rate at which he generally progressed when Holmes was in the room doing something interesting and not explaining it. Holmes had been at his desk for the better part of an hour. He was not writing, or not primarily writing. He was arranging. The 3 documents from the day's events, ledger page, receipt, schoolmaster's notebook, had been joined by 2 further sheets from Holmes's own files, and he had been moving them in relation to one another with the quiet concentration of a man solving a spatial puzzle, as if the physical proximity of one paper to another might yield something the reading of each in isolation had not. Watson had watched this process with the fond, patient attention he brought to most of Holmes's desk work, interested enough to observe, wise enough not to comment. It was at 6:30 that the bell rang with the particular confident rhythm that Watson had, over years, come to associate with official business. Holmes heard it too. He looked up briefly, then back at his papers. "Lestrade," he said. Watson looked at him. "You can't possibly know that from a bell ring." "I know it from the hour, the rhythm, and the fact that he sent a note this morning saying he might call in the evening, which I neglected to mention because I assumed it would come to nothing." Holmes capped his pen. "It appears it has come to something after all. Or rather, to tea, which is approximately the same thing where Lestrade is concerned." Mrs. Hudson's tread on the stairs confirmed it, and then Lestrade himself appeared in the doorway. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, compact and dark-eyed, carrying his hat under one arm and an expression of mild professional satisfaction that Watson associated with a man who has tidied up something routine and feels entitled to a moderately comfortable evening as a result. His coat was very wet. He had clearly walked at least part of the way. "Holmes?" he said. "Watson?" He looked at the fire with the undisguised appreciation of a man who has been out in an October evening for longer than he intended. Rotten night. "Consistently so," Holmes agreed pleasantly. "Sit down, Lestrade. Mrs. Hudson." "Already on," said Mrs. Hudson from the doorway, with the tone of a woman who had anticipated this development and found it only mildly inconvenient. She withdrew. Within what seemed an improbably short time, the tea, things arrived, a fresh pot, 3 cups this time, and a plate of shortbread that Watson was fairly sure had not existed earlier in the afternoon, and which Mrs. Hudson must have produced by some domestic alchemy that he had long since given up trying to understand. Lestrade settled into the chair across from Holmes, hung his damp hat on the arm, and accepted his tea with the straightforward gratitude of a man who has been cold and is now warm, and considers this a significant improvement in his circumstances. "I won't stay long," he said, which, in Watson's experience, meant he would stay at least 40 minutes. "I had a report to drop to you. Nothing urgent, just a forgery matter over in Southwark that has your fingerprints on it, in the metaphorical sense. Fellow passing bank drafts with a specific kind of ink alteration method you identified in a case last February. Thought you'd want the closure." He produced a folded report from his inside coat pocket and set it on the table, beside the shortbread. Holmes picked it up, read it in the way he read things, quickly, completely, with the slight forward tilt of someone absorbing rather than scanning, and set it down again. "Yes," he said, "the altered drafts. I expected this outcome. How was the ink alteration identified? Chemical test, as you suggested at the time." Lestrade said this with the particular tone of a man giving credit that costs him relatively little and knowing it. "The examiner you recommended, The one in Holborn. He's reliable, Holmes said. He's expensive, Lestrade said. The two are not mutually exclusive, Holmes said pleasantly, and in examinations of this kind, the former is considerably more important than the latter. Lestrade made the expression that Watson thought of as his agreeing while not entirely agreeing face, and reached for the shortbread. The conversation drifted, as conversations at 221B tended to drift when Lestrade was present, through several unremarkable cases from the Yard's recent books, a development in the reorganization of a particular division that Lestrade found irritating and described at moderate length, a question about a monograph Holmes had supposedly been writing for the past several months on the analysis of typewriter typefaces, which Holmes deflected with the ease of long practice. Watson contributed occasionally, mostly to keep the conversational flow from stalling, and ate 2 pieces of shortbread. It was during a natural pause, Lestrade refilling his cup, Watson leaning forward to shift a coal that had listed slightly in the grate, that Holmes said, with the elaborate casualness of a man noting something of no particular importance. "Have you had anything come through the Yard recently about city counting houses, account management firms, that kind of thing?" Lestrade looked up from his tea. "Counting houses? Not as such. There was a minor thing about a company changing staff. Came in as background on a different matter. Why?" "Idle curiosity," Holmes said. "I had occasion to look at some account figures today, and it made me think about the clerking trade. It is a considerable industry when one looks at it. Thousands of households in London managing their domestic accounts through small commercial intermediaries." This was, Watson reflected, an entirely true statement, delivered in a tone that contained not a single detectable trace of its actual relevance, and he found himself briefly and privately impressed. Lestrade settled back. "There was something," he said, with the slight rhetorical loosening of a man who has been offered a conversational invitation and is deciding whether to walk through it. "Came through as background notes on a landlord dispute in the city. Not a criminal matter, civil case. Nothing to do with us, really. Counting house called." He paused, reached for his memory. "Renwick and Associates. Or Renwick and something. Small firm managing household disbursements for several landlord estates in Clerkenwell and around Euston Way. Changed their head clerk about 6 weeks ago. The old clerk left without notice, which caused a small administrative difficulty for some of their clients. The civil case was about the delay in payments, not anything more serious." He said all of this with the flat, informational tone of someone recounting the contents of a filing cabinet. Relevant once, filed, forgotten. Watson did not look at Holmes. Holmes did not look at Watson. "Renwick and Associates," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I believe I have heard the name. Clerkenwell district?" "And Euston," Lestrade confirmed. "Small outfit. Maybe 50, 60 client households. Landlord estate management, mostly." He finished his shortbread. "Why? Has something come up?" "Nothing definite," Holmes said. "As I said, idle curiosity about the trade." He moved the conversation smoothly sideways. Asked Lestrade about the Southwark forgery. Case's court date, which Lestrade knew and was willing to discuss at some length, and the matter of the counting house was set aside as easily as it had been raised, like a book returned to its shelf. Watson looked at the fire. Renwick and Associates. The paper stock from the ledger page, a small commercial firm, Clerkenwell district. Miss Holt in Clerkenwell. Mr. Fenn, near Euston. A head clerk who had left 6 weeks ago without notice, which was precisely when, Watson estimated, the pattern of small discrepancies in the accounts might have ended, or might have begun, depending on which clerk had been responsible. He reached for the last piece of shortbread and ate it with great composure. Lestrade stayed, as predicted, the better part of 40 minutes. He discussed the reorganization of his division for rather longer than the subject merited, expressed a low opinion of a particular new administrative procedure, and accepted a third cup of tea with the grateful ease of a man who has warm company and no pressing reason to leave. He was, Watson thought, not for the first time, a fundamentally decent man, sometimes imprecise in his methods, occasionally limited in his imagination, but honest in his work, and genuinely committed to the city he served. These were not small qualities. When he finally rose to leave, reaching for his hat and finding his coat less damp than before, he paused at the door. "If that counting-house business amounts to anything," he said, with a shrewd look at Holmes that suggested Lestrade was perhaps slightly less easily redirected than he sometimes appeared, "I'd appreciate a note before it becomes something official." "Of course," Holmes said, with perfect sincerity. "A note before anything official. You have my word." Lestrade nodded, satisfied, and descended the stairs with Mrs. Hudson's good evening following him to the door. The sound of the street door closing. Rain. Silence. Holmes was at the desk before Watson had fully turned from the window. He moved the lamp to its closest position and laid one finger on the faded stamp at the corner of the ledger page, the blurred mark with its fragments of letter, the capital R, and the shape after it. "R," Watson said quietly, from across the room. "Rennick," Holmes confirmed. He looked at the stamp for a long moment, then up at Watson, and there was in his expression the quiet, focused satisfaction of a man who has placed the last visible piece of a puzzle, and can now see the shape of the remaining gap clearly enough to know what fills it. "The paper matches the firm," Watson said. "The accounts match the district. The clients match the arrangement." "And the clerk left 6 weeks ago," Holmes said, "without notice." He looked at the papers, the ledger page, the receipt, the schoolmaster's careful notebook. All was made to leave, or left because something was about to be discovered. He sat back. "We need to know which." Watson looked at the assembled papers. Small, domestic, ordinary things. A torn page, a household receipt, a retired teacher's arithmetic. Each one negligible alone. Together, in Holmes's lamplight, they outlined something that had been conducted quietly and carefully across dozens of households for months, invisible in its smallness, significant only in its accumulation. "What do you do now?" Watson asked. Holmes picked up his violin. "Now," he said, "we wait for Mycroft." Watson looked at him. "Does Mycroft know something?" "Mycroft always knows something," Holmes said. "The question is whether he has decided it is worth mentioning." He drew the bow across the strings, a slow, even note that filled the room and settled into the fire's quiet warmth. "I sent him a note this afternoon. We shall see what he considers important enough to send back." Outside, the rain continued. London kept its accounts, its secrets, its 10,000 small transactions conducted daily on trust and paper. And at 2:21 the lamp burned steadily over 5 documents that were beginning, at last, to tell a single story. The note from Mycroft arrived the following morning. not early. Mycroft was not, by nature or by habit, an early correspondent. He operated on his own internal schedule, which bore only a passing relationship to the clocks of ordinary men, and which Watson had come to understand was governed less by the hour of day than by the precise moment at which a piece of information became, in Mycroft's estimation, worth the effort of communicating. This moment arrived, apparently, at 23 minutes past 10, because that was when the private messenger knocked at the street door and Mrs. Hudson brought the envelope upstairs with the particular expression she reserved for Mycroft's communications, a mixture of respect and mild unease, as if the envelopes themselves carried an atmosphere of consequence. It was a small envelope, very white, sealed with a plain wax impression that bore no crest or initial. Mycroft's correspondence was never traceable by its exterior to its sender, which Watson had always found simultaneously impressive and slightly unsettling, like many things about Mycroft Holmes. Holmes was at the breakfast table when it arrived, in the middle of his second cup of tea, and what appeared to be a moderately absorbing study of the previous day's financial pages. He took the envelope from Mrs. Hudson, turned it once in his hands, and set it beside his teacup without opening it. Watson looked at him over his toast. "You're not going to open it." "In a moment," Holmes said, and returned to the financial pages. Watson ate his toast. Holmes finished his column. Then, with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to all his desk work, he opened the envelope with a single clean movement and extracted a single sheet of paper, smaller than a standard letter sheet, the kind used for internal memoranda, folded once. He read it. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but Watson, who had spent enough years watching Holmes read things to develop a reasonable literacy in his micro-expressions, caught the slight stilling of the eyes that meant the text had confirmed something rather than introduced something new. Holmes set the memo flat on the table beside the teacup. "Well," he said. Watson waited. "Mycroft describes it as unimportant," Holmes said. "He has underlined the word, which is his way of indicating it is anything but." He slid the memo across the table. Watson picked it up. It was brief, 4 sentences, written in a small, extremely precise hand that managed to be both efficient and somehow authoritative. The handwriting of a man who considers every word a resource to be allocated carefully. The content was this: a government supply account managed through a contracted civilian firm for the disbursement of small household allowances to retired civil servants in the Clerkenwell and Euston districts, had flagged an arithmetic anomaly in its quarterly review. The anomaly had been identified as minor rounding discrepancies across multiple accounts. It had been resolved internally. The contracted firm was Renwick and Associates. Watson read it twice. "Resolved internally," he said. "Meaning the anomaly was identified, attributed to clerical error, and corrected on paper without further investigation," Holmes said. "Which is what happens when a discrepancy is small enough to be embarrassing, but not large enough to be criminal, in the estimation of the person reviewing it. But it was the same firm, the same pattern, and now a third category of client, government supply accounts, which Mycroft's department oversees at several removes." Holmes took the memo back, looked at it once more, and then rose from the table and carried it to the sitting-room desk. Watson followed, bringing his second cup of tea. The desk, by now, had acquired the character of a carefully tended garden, everything placed with intention, each document in clear relation to the others. Holmes laid Mycroft's memo at the top of the arrangement and stood back to look at the whole. Ledger page, Miss Holt's receipt, Mr. Fenn's notebook figures, Mycroft's memo, 4 documents, 1 firm, 1 pattern. Holmes stood at the desk for a long moment without speaking. Watson settled in his armchair, cup in hand, and waited with the patience of a man who has learned that this particular silence is productive and should not be interrupted. Outside, the morning had arrived in better spirits than the previous 2 days. The rain had paused overnight, and the sky was a pale, washed grey that let through a diffuse, gentle light. Baker Street below was busier than it had been, the wet pavements reflecting the movement of boots and wheels and umbrellas still carried as a precaution. Then Holmes turned from the desk, took his own chair, and looked at Watson with the expression Watson privately thought of as the explanation face, the particular focused composure Holmes wore when he had arrived at the end of his reasoning, and was now prepared to walk someone else through it. "Tell me," Watson said simply. Holmes pressed his fingers together. "A clerk," he said, "at Renwick and Associates, a small city counting house, managing household disbursements for several landlord estates. And, it now appears, at least one government supply account has been, for some period of months, adjusting account figures downward by very small amounts, never more than 6pence in a single transaction. Across any individual client account, the loss across a month amounts to perhaps a shilling, perhaps 2. Trivial. The kind of figure that falls within the natural tolerance of household accounting. Most people do not check their disbursement receipts against their own parallel records with the precision of a retired mathematics teacher. But accumulated across 60 households, Watson said. Across 60 households, over 6 months, at an average discrepancy of 1 shilling per household per month, Holmes said. You have 30 shillings per month, £18 across 6 months. Watson was quiet for a moment. £18 was not a fortune, but for a clerk's wages it was a considerable supplement, perhaps a third of an annual salary, gathered invisibly, a few pence at a time from people who would never notice any single transaction. "And the government accounts," he said. "Add those, and the figure climbs further. Mycroft's memo indicates the anomaly in the supply accounts alone amounted to," Holmes glanced at the memo, "4 shillings and 9pence over a quarter. Multiply that across however many similar accounts exist within that supply arrangement, and the quarterly total becomes significant." Watson looked at the papers. How was it done mechanically? The false totals on the receipts. How does a clerk produce them without the firm's records? Showing the correct figures? Holmes nodded. The nod of a man who has been waiting for precisely this question. This is the elegant part of it, and the part that required the ledger page to understand properly. The clerk does not alter the firm's master ledger. That would be immediately detectable at any audit. Instead, he generates the client receipts himself, as clerks in such firms routinely do, since the senior partners rarely review individual small account receipts. He enters the correct figures in the master ledger, because those figures balance with the incoming payments from the landlord estates and supply accounts. But on the receipt he sends to the client, he writes a slightly lower total. Holmes paused. The difference between the correct figure and the lower figure goes somewhere, most probably into a second set of petty records maintained by the clerk alone, or simply pocketed directly in cases where the disbursement was made in coin rather than draft. Watson thought about this. So the firm's own books are clean. The firm's own books are entirely clean. The fraud exists only in the gap between the master ledger and the client receipts. And since most clients never compare the two, the gap is invisible. Holmes looked at the torn ledger page. Except that someone had access to the master ledger and tore out a page and sent it here. Watson set down his teacup. The whistleblower. The messenger who came in the rain, Holmes said, who left without giving his name, who carried the page carefully, tucked against himself, in the manner of someone protecting something they are not certain they should have taken. He looked at Watson. A clerk, I think. Junior, possibly. Someone who works, or worked, within the firm, and had access to the master records. Someone who discovered what was happening, and did not know what to do with the knowledge. Watson thought about the brief description Mrs. Hudson had given the young man at the door, quite wet, who had become vague when questioned and retreated into the rain before she could press him. He was frightened, Watson said. He was frightened, Holmes confirmed, and he chose Baker Street, which tells us he knows who I am and trusts, or hopes, that I might handle this with some discretion. He paused, which is a considerable act of faith from someone in a vulnerable position. The room was quiet for a moment. Rain had begun again outside, very lightly, just the faintest sound against the upper panes. The fire breathed steadily. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson was moving through her morning routine with its familiar, grounding rhythm. Watson looked at the papers on the desk, the accumulated evidence of something small and systematic and unkind, conducted against people who would never have known it was happening. Miss Holt's neighbour, who paid her accounts carefully and trusted the receipts she was sent. Mr. Fenn, who had kept his parallel record for 31 years out of habit, and the deep-grained precision of a man who had taught mathematics and taken it seriously. The retired civil servants in Mycroft's supply accounts, drawing small household allowances, each one reduced by a fraction of a penny at a time. None of them were wealthy, Watson said. No, Holmes said. The accounts managed by Renwick are all modest, small landlord estates, household staff wages, pensioners' allowances. This is not a fraud against institutions that can absorb it. It is a fraud against people who count their shillings. He said this without particular heat, but with a quiet directness that Watson recognized as something genuine. Which is why I intend to return the money before anyone is publicly named. Watson looked up. Return it? How? Through the firm's accounts, as a correction, attributed to the clerk's error, resolved internally, much as Mycroft's department resolved their own anomaly without apparent interest in its cause. Senior partners at Renwick will be invited to use a system's own indifference as a tool. The senior partners at Renwick will be invited to make good the discrepancies quietly. They will do so because the alternative is a public investigation that examines their oversight, and no counting house survives that kind of examination with its reputation intact. And the clerk who did it? Holmes was quiet for a moment. That, he said, depends somewhat on the clerk who sent us the ledger page. He rose from his chair, moved to the window, and looked out at the rain-brightened street below. There are two clerks in this story, Watson, one who took the money, and one who found out, and was frightened enough to send a torn page through the rain to a stranger's door rather than go to the police. He turned back. The second one has already shown considerable courage. I think he deserves the chance to tell me why." Watson nodded slowly. On the desk, the 4 documents lay in their careful arrangement: a small ledger page, a household receipt, a schoolmaster's notebook, a government memo. Ordinary papers, the kind that pass through London every day in their thousands, handled and filed and forgotten. These ones had found their way to Baker Street and had been read at last properly. The fire settled. The clock moved toward noon. Holmes reached for his violin. The message went out that same afternoon. Holmes wrote it himself. Not a long note. Not an official summons. Nothing that might frighten a cautious person into further retreat. Watson watched him compose it at the desk with the focused economy he brought to all written communication. 3 sentences, no more. The first acknowledged that the ledger page had arrived safely. The second said that no names had been given to anyone, and none would be, without permission. The third said simply that Baker Street was available the following morning, should the recipient wish to speak. He sealed it, addressed it to a name Watson had not heard before, a Mr. T. Aldwick, care of a stationer's shop in Clerkenwell, and gave it to Mrs. Hudson for dispatch by the afternoon post. Then he returned to his violin, and the evening passed in the comfortable manner of evenings at 221B, when the work is done, and the waiting has begun. Fire, music. Watson's novel making slightly better progress than it had in the previous days. Rain returning and departing and returning again with its tireless October persistence. Watson slept well. The following morning arrived with a change in the weather, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, and left behind a clean, cold brightness that made the street below look freshly rendered, every cobblestone distinct, every lamp-post casting a clear pale shadow in the thin November light that had replaced October's grey while no one was watching. Watson noticed it when he drew back his bedroom curtain and stood for a moment looking out at the changed quality of the air, with the mild, grateful surprise that fine weather after several days of rain always produces. Breakfast was good. Mrs. Hudson had made porridge as well as the usual toast, which Watson took as evidence of her own response to the improved morning. She had a domestic attentiveness to weather that expressed itself in the kitchen, and a cold, clear day, after sustained grey, reliably produced something warm and substantial. Holmes ate a portion, which Watson noted and did not comment on. They read their respective papers. The fire was bright, and the room was warm, and the morning had the particular quality of a day that intends to be useful. At 20 minutes past 10, the bell rang. Not the confident ring of official business, not the purposeful ring of a client with an appointment. A tentative ring, pressed once, briefly, as if the person had decided to ring, and immediately wondered if they should have. Holmes set down his paper. Watson did not look up from his, which was a deliberate and considered act of normalcy. There was, he had found, a specific kind of person for whom the sight of a room full of attentive eyes could be the final discouragement, and he suspected the person now ascending Mrs. Hudson's stairs was exactly that kind. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a young man behind her. He was perhaps 24 or 25, slight in build, with the careful, slightly formal dress of a junior clerk, dark coat, clean collar, boots that had been polished recently and walked through puddles since. His hair was neat. His face was not, or rather, it was the face of someone who had slept poorly for several nights in succession, and had done his best to compensate with soap and a comb, and had not fully succeeded. He had brown eyes that moved quickly around the room, taking inventory, registering the fire and the desk, and Holmes in his armchair, and Watson behind his paper, and arriving at no visible conclusion about whether any of this was safe. He held his hat in both hands. "Mr. Aldwych," Holmes said, with a warmth in his voice that Watson recognized as entirely deliberate and entirely genuine at the same time, the particular quality Holmes produced when he wanted someone frightened to feel less so. "Come in. Sit down. Watson, would you—" "All ready," said Watson, who was at the tea-things, before Holmes finished the sentence. The young man, Aldwych, sat in the offered chair with the careful posture of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. He set his hat on his knee and looked at Holmes with the expression of a man who has walked to the edge of a thing and is not entirely certain it was wise. "You received my note," Holmes said. It was not a question. It was simply an acknowledgment, a small, gentle confirmation that the path here had been deliberately laid, and that walking it had not been a mistake. "Yes, sir," Aldwych said. His voice was quiet, a London accent, educated somewhat beyond its origins, the kind produced by a grammar school education and several years in a commercial office. "And you came," Holmes said, "which took more courage than you perhaps realize." Aldwych looked at him. Something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, but measurably. A small release, as if a knot had been eased one turn. Watson brought the tea. 3 cups, the good biscuits, the fire bright behind him. He set Aldwich's cup closest to the young man's hand, and settled back in his own chair with his own cup, and the air of a man who is present, but not pressing. A skill Watson had developed over years of accompanying Holmes into precisely these kinds of rooms. Aldwych wrapped both hands around the cup. Warmth and something to hold. Watson had prescribed this before, in other circumstances, to other frightened people, and had always found it sound. "Tell me," Holmes said, "in whatever order feels natural. I have no fixed questions. I have some things I believe I understand, and I would like to know if I am right, but there is no urgency and no pressure. Begin where you like." Aldwych looked at the tea. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of reluctance, Watson thought, but the silence of someone ordering something inside themselves, deciding where the beginning was. "I have worked at Renwick and Associates for 2 years, he said. "Junior clerk. I manage correspondence, maintain the filing records, sometimes prepare the client receipts when Mr. Harlow, the head clerk, is occupied with the larger accounts." He paused. Was the head clerk. "He has left the firm," Holmes said gently. 6 weeks ago." Aldwich's hands tightened slightly on the cup. "He was asked to leave. The senior partners. Mr. Renwick is quite old. He is rarely in the office. His son manages the day work. Mr. Renwick the younger told us simply that Harlow had resigned for personal reasons. But I knew it was, not that." "Because you had already found the receipts," Holmes said. Aldwych looked up quickly. "You know." "I know the shape of it," Holmes said. "Tell me what you saw." Aldwych set down his cup carefully and pressed his hands flat on his knees. The posture, Watson thought, of someone about to say something they have rehearsed and are determined to say accurately. "I was preparing client receipts," he said. 3 months ago, perhaps a little more, Harlow had given me a batch to complete. Routine disbursements, small household accounts, the sort I had done many times. I cross-referenced the master ledger as I always did, to confirm the figures. He paused. The figures in the ledger and the figures Harlow had written in the draft receipts did not match. The receipts were lower, Holmes said. Yes, by small amounts, never more than 6pence, as you said in your note. I thought at first it was a copying error, that Harlow had simply transposed a figure. But there were 7 receipts in the batch, and all 7 had discrepancies, all in the same direction, all downward. He looked at Holmes. I rechecked twice, 3 times. The ledger figures were correct. They balanced with the incoming payments from the landlord accounts. It was only the outgoing receipts that were wrong. Watson looked at the fire. He was thinking about the moment, the young man at a clerk's desk, comparing figures for the 3rd time, understanding slowly what the figures meant, and then understanding what understanding them meant for him. "What did you do?" Holmes asked. "Nothing," Aldwych said. "That first time I corrected the drafts to match the ledger and said nothing. I told myself it was an error. That evening I thought about it more and decided it could not be an error, because Harlow was meticulous. He had been head clerk for 11 years, and I had never seen him make a copying error in 2 years of working beside him." He paused. Over the following weeks, began to check the previous receipts, the ones already sent to clients. I went back through the filing records, compared what had been sent against the master ledger entries. He took a slow breath. The pattern went back at least 8 months. Every batch of client receipts. Every time. The room was quiet, except for the fire, and the faint sound of the street below. A cart, a passing voice, the ordinary texture of the city going about its morning. 8 months, Watson said quietly. Aldwych looked at him. 40 or 50 households, some of them checked every month, some quarterly. Small amounts each time. I calculated the total, approximately. He named a figure. It was larger than the number Holmes had estimated to Watson the previous day, though of the same order of magnitude. Holmes nodded slowly. "When did Harlow leave?" "About a week after I began checking the old records," Aldwych said. "I don't know if he knew I was checking. I was careful. But he may have. He noticed things. He was that kind of man. Very observant." He stopped. "When Mr. Renwick told us he had resigned, I did not know what to do. The discrepancies were in the past receipts, which had already been sent. Harlow was gone, and the records that showed what he had done were sitting in the firm's filing cabinet, and I was the only person who knew to look at them in that way." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Watson asked, not critically, simply asking. Aldwych looked at his hands. "Because," he said after a moment, "if I went to the police, the firm would be investigated. The filing records would be examined. Mr. Renwick the Younger would be questioned about his oversight. The client's accounts would be gone through publicly." He paused. "Most of our clients are. They are not wealthy people, Dr. Watson. They are household account holders, pensioners, working families paying their coal and grocery bills through us because it was arranged through their landlords, and they trusted it. If there was a public investigation, their names would be in reports, their account details examined by officials, and the whole arrangement would likely collapse, which would cause them considerable difficulty." He looked up. "I did not want to be the person who caused that difficulty in the name of correcting a wrong." Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes was watching Aldwych with an expression Watson recognized, and was glad to see. A specific, quiet quality of attention that meant Holmes had assessed the person in front of him and found them, in the essential way that mattered, reliable. "So you tore out a page from the master ledger," Holmes said, "and sent it to Baker Street." "I had read about you," Aldwych said simply, "in the newspapers, and there are accounts published by Dr. Watson. I thought—" He stopped, seemed briefly uncertain of his own logic at this distance. "I thought you might look at it and understand it without needing me to explain it, formally, without names, without it becoming official." He looked at Holmes directly. "I thought if anyone could resolve something like this quietly, it would be you." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, "You thought correctly." Aldwych let out a breath that Watson suspected had been held, in various forms, for the better part of 3 months. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "I want to tell you what I intend to do, and I want you to tell me if any part of it troubles you. You have as much say in this as I do, more, in some respects, because you are the person who carried it." Aldwych nodded. "Harlow will not be prosecuted publicly," Holmes said. "The evidence exists, the ledger, the receipts, the pattern you identified. But a public prosecution serves the newspapers more than it serves the people he took from. Instead, I intend to approach Mr. Renwick the younger with a proposition. The firm will make good every discrepancy, to every client, presented as a corrective. Audit. The total is not ruinous for a counting house of their standing. In exchange, the matter does not become a police case." Holmes paused. "Renwick the younger has every incentive to agree, since the alternative is a public examination of his oversight, which was, at the very least, insufficient." Aldwych was listening with complete attention. "And Harlow?" "Harlow is already gone," Holmes said. "His name will not appear in any document I produce. That is not leniency toward him. It is protection for the clients, whose accounts would otherwise become exhibits." He held Aldwich's gaze. "Your name also will not appear." Aldwych was quiet. Outside, a church bell somewhere in the distance marked the 1/4 hour, its note travelling across the rooftops with the clean clarity that cold, clear air allows. "The people who lost money," Aldwych said carefully, "they will actually receive it back." "Every penny," Holmes said. "I will ask Mycroft to verify the supply accounts, independently. The private household accounts I will confirm through the firm's correction records, which I will require Renwick to provide." He paused. "You have my word." Watson watched Aldwych take this in, watched the particular process of a person deciding to trust, which is not a single moment, but a series of small interior concessions, each one following the last. "All right," Aldwych said finally, quietly. Holmes nodded. He rose, went to the desk, and wrote something briefly on a card. His own visiting card, Watson saw, with a few words added in his small handwriting. He returned and held it out. "If anyone at the firm asks questions that concern you, or if anything changes in a way that makes your position there uncomfortable, you will send word to me directly." He set the card in Aldwich's hand. "Not through a messenger this time, a letter with your name on it. You have nothing to fear from being known to me." Aldwych looked at the card for a moment. Then he put it in his coat pocket with the careful movement of someone securing something they intend to keep. He finished his tea. Holmes asked him 2 or 3 further questions. Details about the firm's accounting schedule, the structure of the client receipt process, the name of the landlord estate served. And Aldwych answered all of them with the same precise, reliable quality he had brought to everything he'd said. The deep-grained accuracy of a man who has spent 2 years checking figures and considers getting them right a matter of basic honesty. When he rose to leave, he was different in bearing from the young man who had come through the door 40 minutes earlier, not transformed. It was a quiet difference, the kind produced not by drama, but by the specific relief of having carried something alone for a long time and finding that setting it down at last was possible. Mrs. Hudson saw him out with her customary composure, and the street door closed, and Baker Street resumed its ordinary morning sounds. Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes was at the desk, the documents arranged before him, already writing. He was telling the truth throughout, Watson said. Every word, Holmes said without looking up, and you'll do what you said. Return every penny. Every penny, Holmes confirmed. It is, in the end, a simple accounting problem. He paused, pen in hand. The arithmetic was Harlow's doing. The correction is simply arithmetic in the other direction. Watson looked at the fire, steady, warm, the coals burning cleanly in the bright cold morning. 40 or 50 households, small amounts, people who counted their shillings and trusted the receipts they were sent. Every penny. He picked up his tea, which had gone slightly cool, and drank it anyway. Holmes paid a visit to Renwick and Associates on a Thursday morning. Watson did not accompany him. This was a deliberate arrangement. Holmes had said the previous evening that the conversation with Renwick's younger would go most smoothly with one person in the room, since 2 suggested official proceedings, and 1 suggested a private understanding. And a private understanding was precisely what was required. Watson had agreed, had read his novel by the fire for 2 hours, had drunk 3 cups of tea, and had found himself, by the time Holmes returned at 11:30, in a state of moderate domestic contentment that he felt no need to justify. Holmes came in with the cold air of the street still on his coat, and the expression of a man who has conducted a negotiation, and found it less difficult than the other party had initially wished to make it. "Well?" said Watson. Holmes unwound his scarf. "Renwick is a practical man," he said. "Beneath the initial alarm, which was considerable but brief, he is a practical man. He understood the situation within approximately 4 minutes. The remaining 20 minutes were devoted to the mechanics of the correction." He hung his coat. "He will issue corrective payments to all affected clients within the fortnight, attributed to a routine audit discrepancy. The letters will be courteous, the amounts exact, and the explanation will be the minimum required to satisfy without alarming." And he agreed to Mycroft's supply accounts. He had rather less choice about those. Holmes sat down. "Mycroft's department will receive a formal correction through the standard supply account channel. Mycroft has already indicated this is satisfactory." He accepted the tea Watson had ready for him with the straightforward appreciation of a man who has been out in the cold and is now in. The matter is, in its practical dimensions, concluded. Watson poured his own cup. "And Harlow?" "Gone," Holmes said simply. "Renwick will not pursue him, partly because to do so would require explaining publicly why the firm's oversight permitted the scheme to run for 8 months, and partly because Harlow left no forwarding address." He looked at the fire. "He will not work in city accounting again, I think. Word travels in those circles without requiring newspapers." Watson nodded. It was not, he thought, a perfect resolution in the abstract sense. A wrong had been done, and its author had not faced formal consequence. But the people who had lost money would receive it back. The frightened young man who had carried a torn page through the rain had been protected. The households in Clerkenwell and Euston would receive their corrective letters, and perhaps wonder briefly at the audit's diligence before filing the letters away and thinking no more about it. In the practical sense, in the sense of what had actually been made better, it seemed to Watson reasonably satisfactory. "I shall make a note," he said, thinking of his journal. "Make a brief one," Holmes said pleasantly, "and then perhaps put it away. This one functions better unpublished." Watson considered this. For Aldwick's sake. For several people's sake. Holmes reached for the ledger page, which still lay on the desk where it had sat since the rainy evening that now felt several weeks distant, rather than several days. He looked at it once, with the particular finality of a concluded examination, and then folded it precisely along its original creases. This goes back to him. It is his evidence. He should be the one to decide what becomes of it. Watson watched Holmes address a small envelope, Mr. T. Aldwick, the Clerkenwell stationer, and insert the folded page and seal it. A thing returned. A record restored to the person who had risked something to send it. He thought that was right. The days that followed had the quality of a returning tide. Ordinary things reasserting themselves after a period of mild displacement. The regular texture of Baker Street life settling back into its familiar patterns with the ease of something that knows its own shape. Holmes returned to his various projects with the focused energy he always brought to whatever occupied him after a case concluded. There was a paper on ash types he had been constructing for months, and a correspondence with a colleague in Vienna about a matter of chemical analysis, and the perennial question of his filing system, which Watson privately believed Holmes kept in a state of deliberate productive disorder, rather than ever allowing it to reach the resolution it theoretically approached. Watson returned to his practice, which had accumulated several days of correspondence requiring attention, and to his writing, and to the comfortable rhythms of a life that was, he had long since concluded, a remarkably good one. Mrs. Hudson changed the flowers in the downstairs hall, which she did every fortnight with a regularity Watson found quietly stabilizing. The coalman came on Friday. The butcher sent an excellent joint on Saturday morning. Small, domestic, reliable things. On the following Wednesday, a short note arrived for Holmes from Renwick Associates, confirming that the corrective letters had been dispatched to all affected client households. Holmes read it, set it aside, and returned to his paper on ash without comment. On Thursday, a brief note from Mycroft, 2 sentences, confirming the supply account correction had been received and processed. Holmes read this one with rather more amusement, because Mycroft had described the entire matter as tided, which was, Watson agreed, a very Mycroft word, for a thing that had required rather more than tidying. On Friday morning, Watson encountered Mrs. Hudson on the landing, and she mentioned, in her composed and informational way, that she had received a corrective letter from her household accounts firm, not Renwick's, a different firm entirely, but she had mentioned it because it had prompted her to check her own records, and she had found everything in order, which she found reassuring. Watson thought about 40 or 50 households receiving their letters across the Fortnight. He thought about Mr. Fenn, the retired mathematics teacher, opening an envelope and finding his arithmetic confirmed, and his shilling and fourpence returned, and feeling the quiet, specific satisfaction of a man whose parallel records have been vindicated. He thought about Miss Holt's neighbour, who had never known the receipts were wrong, receiving a correction for an error she had not detected, and feeling perhaps only mild puzzlement, which was perfectly fine. He thought these things, and then went downstairs for breakfast and said none of them aloud, which seemed appropriate. The rain returned on Friday evening, not the relentless, committed rain of the preceding week, something gentler. A soft, steady fall that began around 5 o'clock and settled in with the quiet permanence of rain that intends to last the night without making a production of it. It came against the Baker Street windows in the familiar rhythm that Watson had come to think of over his years at 221B as one of the more reliable sounds of home, the particular percussion of this specific window glass, this specific street, at this specific time of day. Holmes noticed it too. He looked up from his papers, turned his head slightly toward the window, and then returned to his papers. A brief acknowledgement, the way one nods to a neighbour. Mrs. Hudson brought the tea tray at 5:30. It was, Watson noted with private appreciation, a particularly good tray. The pot was the large one. There was a plate of plain biscuits, and also a small dish of something Mrs. Hudson had made, a sort of shortbread, buttery and faintly sugared at the edge, the kind that appeared occasionally without announcement, and always at the right moment. There were 2 cups, and the coal cosy was freshened, and the lamp on the desk had been turned to its comfortable evening level. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Watson said. She gave the room a brief, approving survey. Fire burning well, desk moderately tidy by its own standards, both occupants present and not engaged in anything she would need to manage, and withdrew with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose house is in reasonable order. Watson poured. He brought Holmes's cup to the desk and set it where Holmes would find it without looking, which was a placement Watson had calibrated over years to an accuracy that still occasionally surprised him. Holmes picked it up without looking. Watson returned to his armchair. The fire was very good this evening. The coals had caught well, and were burning with a clean, even warmth that spread across the hearthrug and reached Watson's feet and the lower part of his legs in a way that made the armchair feel like a deliberate and considered piece of furniture design rather than simply a chair. He had his novel. He had his tea. He had the rain at the window and the fire at his feet, and Holmes at the desk doing something that generated occasional small sounds of turning pages, and the occasional precise scratch of a pen. He read 3 pages, genuinely this time, following the story, rather than being present with it at a distance. Then Holmes pushed back his chair. He went to the settee and picked up his violin in the unhurried way he had when the day's work was done, and music was not a tool for thinking, but simply music. He drew the bow across the strings once. The same low note Watson remembered from the evening the messenger had come, testing the instrument, listening to the resonance, and then began to play. It was a slow piece, something that Watson did not immediately recognize, though it had the quality of something old, not ancient, but settled, the kind of melody that has been played many times in many rooms, and has acquired the particular depth of a thing that has accompanied human evenings for a long while. It moved without urgency, rising and falling with a patience that matched the rain and the fire and the quiet street outside. Watson set down his novel, not because the music demanded attention. It didn't. It invited it, which is a different thing entirely. He simply set it down and listened, and looked at the fire, and let the evening be what it was. He thought, briefly and without particular weight, about the week just past. The torn ledger page arriving on a rainy Monday evening, the papers accumulating on Holmes's desk, each one a small thread that had turned out to belong to the same cloth. Lestrade and his shortbread. Mycroft and his memo marked unimportant. Miss Holt with her cloth bag and her careful arithmetic. Mr. Fenn with his 31 years of parallel records. Aldwych at the door with his hat in both hands, frightened and determined and right. All of it resolved, quietly, without newspapers or courts or anyone publicly shamed. The money returned, the record corrected, the ledger, in its way, balanced. Watson found he was, in the specific and unpretentious way of a man sitting by his own fire on a Friday evening, content. Holmes played on, the slow melody finding its way through the room with the ease of something at home here, winding through the lamplight and the coal smoke and the sound of the rain. It was the kind of playing that asked nothing of the listener except to be present, which Watson was. Outside, London went about its evening. The cabs moved through the wet streets with their lamps trailing orange in the puddles. The shop fronts along Baker Street sent their warm light out onto the wet pavement in bright rectangles. Somewhere nearby, a church bell marked the hour in the clean, carrying way of bells in cold air, 6 notes, resonant, fading at their own pace. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps moved through the house below in their even, unhurried pattern. The kettle, perhaps. A cupboard closed, the domestic machinery of 221B proceeding with its reliable, reassuring efficiency. Watson thought about writing something in his journal. Not the case, which Holmes was right to leave unpublished, but something else. Some note about the week, about the quality of certain evenings, about what it meant that a young clerk in a dark coat had walked through the rain to a stranger's door with a torn piece of paper and a considerable act of faith, and had found that the faith was warranted. He thought about this, and then decided the journal could wait. The evening didn't need recording to be real. Holmes reached the end of the melody and let the last note stand for a long moment in the room before he lifted the bow. The note decayed slowly, dispersing into the warm air, becoming part of the general quiet. Then he lowered the violin to his knee and looked at Watson with the calm, settled expression of a man who is precisely where he intends to be. "More tea?" Watson said. "Please," said Holmes. Watson got up, moved to the tray, poured 2 fresh cups with the easy familiarity of a man who has performed this action several thousand times, and finds it still entirely satisfactory. He brought Holmes's cup. Holmes accepted it. Watson returned to his armchair. The fire burned. The rain fell. Baker Street was quiet outside its own windows, keeping its secrets and its soot and its 10,000 small stories with the patient, affectionate indifference of a city that has been keeping secrets since before anyone living could remember. The torn ledger page was gone, returned to the person who had sent it. Its figures finally balanced, its smeared stamp no longer needing to be read. The case, such as it was closed. Watson picked up his novel, found his page, began to read. And above the wet rooftops of London, the rain fell on, gentle, persistent, entirely at home.